So I now need to talk about what communism is, right? And you could spend thousands of pages and hundreds of hours talking about communism. I'm not going to do that, but I do need to give you an understanding of how it works because we have to understand that eventually the communists will govern China, and to this day, they govern China. So we need to understand something about how they see the world if we're going to understand how China is going to develop. The founder of communism is traditionally understood to be Karl Marx. He had a colleague, Frederick Engels, but I will just focus on Marx because he did most of the writing. But Marx is interesting because he argues that he is going to study history scientifically, that he's going to discover the natural laws that govern history. So, you know how there's things like gravity and laws of motion and physics and things like that? Karl Marx thought that history also was governed by laws. So, this is where you would have an argument that history is not a humanity, but a social science, because we're trying to discover laws through gathering data and through observation. And Marx argued that in his scientific study of history, that he discovered that what drives history is the economy. Marx believed that the way that human beings produce what they need is what essentially drives history. And Marx argued that principally what makes human beings different is the fact that we develop our environment to suit ourselves by working together. Now, I know there's some animals that will work together to build like dens and things like that, but not to the level of sophistication human beings do. And also, when he talks about the economy driving history, he argues that it drives history through particular economic stages. So, like, notice how so far when we've been talking about China, we divided it into dynastic stages. We had the Ming and then the Qing, and now we have the Republic. But those are political stages. Marx would say, no, we shouldn't divide up history by dynastic stages. We should divide it up by economic stages. Right? And that's important because usually if you especially from a Western traditional view of history, you divide up things by like, who was president, what king was ruling and so forth. But he says that's not so important. What's important is economic stage. Well, now here's the next question. What makes one economic stage different from another economic stage? Right? What fundamentally makes stage 1 different from stage 2? Marx argued that what makes different economic stages different from each other is that they're marked by a different kind of class conflict between the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, Marx's thoughts are deep and complicated, but for our purposes, I have to emphasize you're one or the other. You're either the oppressor or the oppressed. If you're not being oppressed, you're the oppressor. If you're being oppressed, you are the oppressed. So what happens is we enter a different economic stage when there's a different kind of class conflict. And what makes between the oppressor and the oppressed, and what makes the oppressors and the oppressed is the oppressor class owns the means of production and extracts profit from the oppressed. Right? So for example, in feudalism, which we'll talk about momentarily, the oppressor are the lords who own the land, and they force the serfs, the peasants, to work the land and extract profit from their labor. Right? So the oppressor class owns the means of production and extracts profit from the oppressed. Now there's a change with capitalism because there the oppressor class is the factory owner, the means of production is the factory, and the profits extracted from the oppressed from whom the profits are extracted are the workers. Right? So each stage is marked by a different kind of conflict, class conflict between the oppressors and oppressed. And we know who is who because the oppressors own the means of production such as land or factories, and the oppressed are the ones who the oppressors are extracting labor profit from. So, and just to make this a little bit more clear, like I said, in feudalism, the landlords would own the land and oppress the peasants by extracting much of the harvest, right? Basically, the landlords want to extract as much of the harvest as they can without killing the peasants. They don't necessarily want the peasants to be happy. They just don't want them to rebel. They don't want them to die. But they'll extract as much as they think they can without either causing them to rebel and overthrow the landlords or without causing them to die and not be able to work for them anymore. Later, though, history will continue to develop along these economic laws, and feudalism will transform into capitalism. In capitalism, capitalists own the factories and the machines and oppress workers by extracting the profit from their labor. Right? So you can, again, I just want to emphasize this point because this is going to be very important as we continue. And Marx thought that you had to go through these stages one by one. So you have to go through feudalism, and then you go to capitalism. Now, like I said, though, there's nothing really in between. If you are not oppressed, you are an oppressor. Marx thought in terms of class warfare, right? That there's war between these different economic classes, and there's no neutrals. If you are not oppressed, you are an oppressor. Now, this part is very complex, but please bear with me. So, you have this movement from feudalism to capitalism. What comes next? Communism, right? Marx isn't just talking about the past. He's not just talking about the present. He's also talking about the future, right? Karl Marx is in 19th century Europe during the Industrial Revolution. He looks back at feudalism. He's looking back at the past to understand what was happening then talks about what's happening in the present under capitalism, and then talks about what's going to happen in the future, communism. So this is one thing that makes his ideas so attractive. He doesn't just explain the past and why things got the way they were. He explains the future, and he gives this wonderful dream, this wonderful hope of a communist utopia. Now, one thing about Marx, and this is, I think, one thing that makes him so smart and so attractive. I should point out, I'm about as anti-communist as you can get, but I have to recognize genius when I see it. The guy was smart. But one thing he pointed out is this. We're used to thinking of unemployment as bad, right? So, for example, in the United States today, we may say, oh, look, the unemployment is this percent, that's bad. And Marx would say, well, yes and no, it's bad in one way, but it's good in another way. Marx would say unemployment is a sign that production is good, right? What he means by this is we have all these people producing, we have some people not producing, but even though we have people that aren't making anything, we still have more than enough, right? The problem, in a sense, in a capitalist economy isn't that there's no food. It's not that there's not enough clothing. It's that people can't afford to buy the food or the clothing. It exists, but it's not properly distributed. So the economy is good in a sense. The capitalist economy is able to produce a lot. That's great, but it's not distributed properly. And unemployment is a sign of that poor distribution, right? You're making some workers work too much. It would be much better if workers didn't have to work as much, and then everyone could have a job. You know, instead of having instead of having one worker work 8 hours, why not just have two workers work 4 hours, right? Let's just do that. The reason we don't just do that is because the capitalists extract the additional wealth. They want to squeeze the worker. They don't care about the workers. They don't care about helping the workers. So we have unemployment, but we still have enough stuff. So the problem isn't that we're not able to produce enough stuff. The problem is the way that we distribute work and the way we distribute what is produced is bad, right? Instead of having one worker working 8 hours and having one guy unemployed, why not just have both work 4 hours? We'll get enough stuff. We'll make sure everyone has what they need. So what we need is a dictatorship of the proletariat who will make sure that everything is distributed evenly, or as what it was often said, to each according to their need, from each according to their ability, right? We're going to make sure everyone gets what they need. You got a sick kid, we're going to be there for you. Oh, you're healthy and you're very active, great. You can do a little bit more than that sick person. But that's the idea, right? We're going to make sure that work and the fruit of the labor, the products that are made, will be distributed to everyone evenly. So everyone will get enough stuff, right? Everyone will get enough stuff. Now, remember, in communism, conflict is caused by the economy and by this class conflict. Well, if there is no conflict because everyone has enough stuff, and Marx, because he focused on the economy, argued that essentially all conflicts have to do with class conflict and with stuff, with people not having enough stuff. If we make sure everyone has enough stuff, then there's no classes, right? There won't be any different economic classes because everyone will be the same economically. There will be no conflict. If there's no conflict, we don't need an oppressive government to control us, right? There's no conflict. We don't need an oppressive government to control us. Therefore, we will have perfect freedom and the time to enjoy it, right? So the communist utopia was this. You would work some. Everyone would work. But you wouldn't have to do that much work because work would be distributed evenly. And the fruit of that work would be distributed evenly, so everyone got what they needed. We would all be the same economic class because we all had what we needed. And then therefore there would be no conflict. We don't need a government to stop conflict anymore. We don't need police even. And so when you put all this together, everyone will have enough stuff and we'll have the perfect freedom and the time to enjoy it. Isn't that a wonderful world? Right? If that could be, wouldn't that be great? Could you imagine that? Having enough stuff and having the freedom and the time to enjoy it. That would be great. And that's why many people were so attracted to this idea. Especially imagine these ideas. This sounds attractive to us today. Imagine you're some poor person in 19th century Europe or in early 20th century China who's barely making ends meet, who's worried about starving to death. Imagine how wonderful this will sound. Now, here's the problem, though. No way are the oppressors ever going to give up their power peacefully. The capitalists are not going to give up without a fight. The capitalists use the army to control unrest. They use the police to arrest workers who want to bring communism. The revolution must be violent because only violence will overcome these capitalists who are willing to use violence against the workers. Right? So that's the first thing we have to understand about the communist revolution. It was meant to be violent. It was understood that it had to be violent. It was also understood that it should happen in industrialized countries first. The logic was, remember, you go through economic classes. You go through economic stages where the classes change. So you go from feudalism to capitalism and then communism. So logically, in order to have communism, you must first have very, very advanced capitalism. You have to have a capitalism in which the workers are squeezed so badly by the capitalists in their search for profits that the workers will rise up and rebel. So the communist revolution, Marx thought, would happen in like Great Britain first because it was the most industrialized country in the world at the time. He lived in Great Britain, by the way, even though he was German. He fled there because of his ideas. So Marx thought that the revolution would be violent, but it wasn't going to happen until the time was right. You go through these economic stages marked by class conflict, and only when class conflict was very advanced, and that would only happen in a very well-developed industrialized country, a very well-developed capitalist country, only then would you have communism, right? You got to go through the stages. And so here's the problem. China was not yet ready, in a sense, for communism because it was still largely feudal. It was still largely agricultural. Right now, Marx talks about feudalism in a way that is different from, say, a medieval European historian would talk about feudalism. But for our purposes, when Marx talks about feudalism and things like that, he's talking about an agricultural state, not an industrialized country. Right? Not an industrialized country. So from the point of view of Marx, China is not yet ready. It's a feudal country, an agricultural country. And that's why I have that image there of that peasant boy. Right? He's not an industrial worker. He's not yet ready for a communist revolution. Now, here's the thing, though. Communists were not just thinkers. They were also doers. And they recognized that in order to bring revolution, they needed to be organized. They needed to be disciplined. This is fundamentally what made communism different from anarchism. Anarchism was a serious political ideology. Now, when you hear anarchy, you tend to think about people breaking stuff. That's not what it was about. But the anarchists, and I'm not trying to be funny, were too disorganized to really bring effective revolution. The communists, through the Communist Party, are going to be disciplined and organized. In addition, one thing that's interesting about communism, and this goes to Marx arguing that it was scientific, was that communists could change their doctrine based on new data. So even though Marx was wrong, that didn't make communists say, oh, well, we shouldn't follow Marx. Because Marx allowed that he could be wrong. He allowed the idea that new data would come about and communism would need to be reassessed. So in communism, you can change the doctrine based on bringing new data, similar to science, right? This is why they claim to be scientific, right? Scientists might think one way, but if they're presented with convincing data, they'll change the way they think. Communists think the same way. And this is key. Even though communism was not supposed to happen yet in China because it was largely feudal, largely agricultural, because of the organization and discipline of the Communist Party, and because communism fundamentally was flexible and willing to change its doctrine in order to accomplish its goal of a communist utopia, China will, in a sense, in fact, I should say, become communist. Right? Even though they're not supposed to be communist, they will become communist in part because of the Communist Party and because they will develop a doctrine that allows them, in a sense, to skip over a lot of the capitalism and to bring a communist revolution. Now, Marx will end up being wrong, of course, because the first country to undergo a successful communist revolution is Russia, which was not a highly industrialized country. However, because of this kind of communist flexibility, the great communist thinker, Vladimir Lenin, will argue that even if you don't have an industrialized country, through the discipline and organizational skills of a communist party, what he would call a vanguard party, you could organize what workers there were to seize power. And that does work. So you do have a successful Russian Revolution. And Russia, the Russian Empire, will transform into what is called the Soviet Union. And it will immediately attract Chinese attention because it promises to repudiate all of the old unequal treaties, right? We talked about how earlier China was forced to sign unequal treaties by Japan, but also by Britain and France and so forth. Now, what's curious is in the end, the Soviet Union does not keep this promise, and it in fact will be the country that will take the most Chinese territory during this time period. But in this early part, this gesture is so powerful that many Chinese people say, oh, this is interesting. Maybe these people are different. And remember, we talked about how there was this feeling of frustration and betrayal at what the liberal democracies had done during the Versailles Treaty, right? The liberal democracies seemed like hypocrites. They're always talking about freedom and democracy and all this stuff, but they're also empires. And they want to keep the colonial peoples down. They don't really believe in equality and freedom and all that stuff. So why not learn more about this communism, right? The Soviet Union, it seems to be willing to change, to do things differently. It doesn't hurt that the Soviet Union will send support, both financial and in terms of advisors, and they will help organize the Chinese Communist Party, which Chen Duxiu will help found. One of the early members of the Chinese Communist Party, who will eventually come to dominate it, is a man named Mao Zedong. He's interesting. He was the son of a relatively wealthy Chinese peasant who supported him getting an education. Mao will end up going to Beijing University, where he will become a librarian and will read about and have exposure to the most recent political ideas. And that will convince him that communism is the best path forward. So here's the thing. Before the rise of communism, the only really serious contenders for building national strength and independence were the liberal democracies, places like Great Britain, France, and the United States. Now, all of a sudden, you've got this other model, this Soviet Union, that promises to be more moral and also not to have the serious problems that afflict Great Britain, France, the United States. All those countries, for example, have unemployment. In all those countries, workers are often treated poorly. Communism promises, though, to fix all that, right? To bring, in a sense, national strength and independence and a communist utopia. But we have to understand that communists are also nationalists. They believe that communism will help make China strong. In a sense, that's their first goal. Right? Communism in many ways is a means for making China strong. And also, like I said, bring the communist utopia, that would be wonderful too. And in particular, we have to remember China is an extraordinarily poor country, And a ideology that promises the sharing of wealth to the poor is going to be very popular because, wow, are there a lot of poor people? And that, in a sense, will give communism the resiliency to be able to endure long decades of oppression and resistance to its ideas. Because communism is not going to be the dominant ideology. Nationalism, particularly that of the Nationalist Party, is. And I have to stress, it's a little bit confusing because the Nationalists are a political party and an ideology. If I use big N for nationalists, it means a political party, right? That's a different political party than the Communist Party. If I use small n, that refers to the ideology of nationalism, and you could be a communist and a nationalist. You're just a communist who believes that communism is the best way to strengthen China, right? And that's a nationalist goal.